É preciso a gente enxergar a realidade como ela é, para poder escolher como se colocar dentro dela. A gente não pode estar se iludindo conforme as ilusões são colocadas. Hoje, as pessoas têm um inimigo dentro de casa, que é o pior inimigo que eu já vi, que se chama televisão. A televisão é comercial e pessoas muito bem pagas trabalham com psicologia do inconsciente para criar valores, para criar objetivos de vida. Porque o massacre publicitário é criminoso. Ele está o tempo todo na cabeça da gente. Você está na rua, vê um produto e tem uma vontade de comprar. Você pensa que a vontade é sua, mas não. Ela foi colocada no seu inconsciente por um publicitário que trabalha com psicologia do inconsciente. A gente anda pela vida abestalhado e não se questiona. É preciso questionar os objetivos que a gente tem, os valores que a gente tem, a visão que a gente tem de mundo, porque essa visão é apresentada distorcida. A gente quer não o que a gente escolhe, mas o que é mandado. E existe uma pressão que te discrimina se você não quiser o que todo mundo quer. Quantas vezes eu ouvi, meu filho, você não pode pensar assim, ninguém pensa assim, você tem que pensar em você mesmo. Existe uma estratégia para você ficar prestando atenção perto de você, nas suas coisas, nas suas roupas, na sua casa, no seu carro, em volta, para você não olhar o mundo, para você não perceber que isso é uma coletividade. Ensinam para a gente que o objetivo da vida é patrimônio, é segurança, é conforto. E não é, é afeto. Há muito tempo atrás, eu tinha 18 anos, ainda estava na faculdade, eu encontrei um velhinho que estava com quase 90 anos, bem velhinho, cheio de doença, e era um rico empresário de exportação e importação. Ele falou umas coisas comigo que, para mim, foram importantíssimas. Ele falou, eu fiz tudo o que me mandaram fazer na vida. Eu corri atrás de patrimônio, eu montei uma empresa e essa empresa deu certo. Eu posso visitar a Europa 3, 4 vezes por ano se eu quiser. Eu, para a sociedade, sou um vitorioso. Mas hoje eu estou doente, eu estou sentindo que a morte está perto, estou tomando um monte de remédio. E aí eu olhei para a minha vida e ela perdeu totalmente o sentido. A sensação que eu tenho é que mentiram para mim em algum lugar. E eu acreditei. Eu não pude conviver com meus filhos, não pude criar afeto com os meus filhos, porque eu estava muito ocupado desenvolvendo a empresa. Então eu paguei pessoas muito bem qualificadas para formá-los. E eles estão muito bem formados, estão bem colocados no planeta, em vários lugares, ganhando só de seu dinheiro. Mas agora eu queria ter afeto, eu queria ter aproximação com eles. E eu não tenho aproximação nenhuma, nem eles comigo. E o que eles fazem? Eles pagam pessoas muito bem qualificadas para cuidar de mim até a morte. Aí eu percebi que o principal da vida é abstrato, não é concreto. Eles dizem que é concreto para a gente passar a vida correndo atrás, pagando o carnê, tendo que ganhar dinheiro e mais dinheiro e mais dinheiro, e ostentar, com vergonha de estar mal vestido. E a gente não dá valor que é importante. É o sentimento de integração com a coletividade, o sentimento de ser útil aos demais, o sentimento de fazer o bem, o sentimento de trocar afeto, amor com todo mundo. Isso é o significado da vida. E as pessoas que correm atrás de patrimônio, de riqueza, elas têm um vazio muito grande, não é à toa que você toma tanto antidepressivo. Será que alguém aqui não sabe que o afeto é a coisa mais importante da vida? A gente sabe, mas esquece, porque o massacre publicitário é criminoso.
É muito louco os caras conseguirem vender a ideia de que nós vencemos é ter dinheiro. Até tem uma música que fala esse bagulho de televisão, que chama Vamos Voltar à Realidade, que vai ser inclusive até o nome do disco que eu vou lançar. Tem uma parte que fala isso, fala assim, Eles querem nos forçar a amar o que nós não podemos ter e fazer tu se apaixonar pelo que não é você. Tu acha que o Nike é vencer? Chega um momento em que tu encara o espelho e não consegue mais se ver. Cadê tua alma? Cadê tua fé, guerreiro? Cadê os princípios? Teu sentimento verdadeiro? Cadê a mulher? Cadê o amor? Cadê? Qual foi? Cadê os parceiros? Vagabundo tá topando tudo por dinheiro. Na ilusão de ser feliz, ninguém aceita o que eles disserem. É o que o diabo quis, o anjo protetor já não interfere. Abdicaram da raiz, vários irmãos se matam em série. Eles alegam, nós só estamos dando ao povo o que eles querem. Cada vez que o ego inflar, tu se sentiu fodão, não esquece que o poder não tem a ver com sensação. Eles estudam teu sentimento, exploram tua emoção. E se ele sabe o que tu sente, pode prever sua reação.
Bernays set out to experiment with the minds of the popular classes. His most dramatic experiment was to persuade women to smoke. At that time there was a taboo against women smoking, and one of his early clients, George Hill, the president of the American Tobacco Corporation, asked Bernays to find a way of breaking it.
He said, we're losing half of our market because men have invoked a taboo against women smoking in public. Can you do anything about that? I said, let me think about it. And then I said, have I your permission to see a psychoanalyst to find out what cigarettes mean to women? He said, what'll it cost? So I called up Dr. Brill, A.A. Brill, who was a leading psychoanalyst in New York at that time.
How come you didn't call your uncle? Why didn't you call your uncle?
Because he was in Vienna.
A.A. Brill was one of the first psychoanalysts in America, and for a large fee he told Bernays that cigarettes were a symbol of the penis and of male sexual power. He told Bernays that if he could find a way to connect cigarettes with the idea of challenging male power, then women would smoke, because then they would have their own penises. Every year, New York held an Easter Day parade to which thousands came, and Bernays decided to stage an event there. He persuaded a group of rich debutantes to hide cigarettes under their clothes. Then they should join the parade, and at a given signal from him, they were to light up the cigarettes dramatically. Bernays then informed the press that he had heard that a group of suffragettes were preparing to protest by lighting up what they called torches of freedom.
He knew this would be an outcry, and he knew that all of the photographers would be there to capture this moment. And so he was ready with a phrase which was torches of freedom. And so here you have a symbol, women, young women, debutantes, smoking a cigarette in public with a phrase that means anybody who believes in this kind of equality pretty much has to support them in the ensuing debate about this, because torches of freedom. I mean, what's on all American coins? It's liberty. She's holding up the torch. You see? And so all of this is there together. There's emotion, there's memory, there's a rational phrase, even though it's using a lot of emotional elements. It's a phrase that works in a rational sense. All of this is together. And so the next day, this was not just in all of the New York papers, it was across the United States and around the world. And from that point forward, the sale of cigarettes to women began to rise. He had made them socially acceptable with a single symbolic act.
What Bernays had created was the idea that if a woman smoked, it made her more powerful and independent, an idea that still persists today.
Embrace me, my sweet embrace.
It made him realize that it was possible to persuade people to behave irrationally if you link products to their emotional desires and feelings. The idea that smoking actually made women freer was completely irrational, but it made them feel more independent.
Cria a ânsia do consumo. Ânsia do consumo. Você tem que consumir para ter valor social. Na favela você vê isso. Eu acho uma puta sacanagem. O cara não tem condição de comprar, então ele se sente um lixo, porque ele não pode comprar. E o bandido, ele vai ostentar as marcas, o ouro, os poderes. A busca é insana. Os profissionais de publicidade são muito bons. Eles criam desejos. E mesmo as pessoas que não podem comprar são escravas desses desejos. Se sentem inferiores porque não podem satisfazer esses desejos, que são plantados por psicólogos do inconsciente, que a publicidade usa para convencer as pessoas. Eu acho isso desumano. E a gente participa disso. A gente participa condicionadamente disso. A gente acaba achando que um cara maltrapilho é ruim. O cara pode ser super generoso, leal, sincero, solidário. Se ele está maltrapilho, ele é mal visto. O cara pode ser um comprador de político que desvia milhões de dinheiro público, que causa sofrimento em milhões de famílias, mas ele está bem vestido, a mídia apresenta ele como exemplo de cidadão bem-sucedido.
Beginning in the early 20s, the New York banks funded the creation of chains of department stores across America. They were to be the outlets for the mass-produced goods, and Bernays' job was to produce the new type of customer. Bernays began to create many of the techniques of mass consumer persuasion that we now live with. He was employed by William Randolph Hearst to promote his new women's magazines, and Bernays glamorized them by placing articles and advertisements that linked products made by others of his clients to famous film stars like Clara Bow, who was also his client. Bernays also began the practice of product placement in the movies, and he dressed the stars at the film's premieres with clothes and jewellery from other firms he represented. He was, he claimed, the first person to tell car companies they could sell cars as symbols of male sexuality. He employed psychologists to issue reports that said products were good for you, and then pretended they were independent studies. He organised fashion shows in department stores, and paid celebrities to repeat the new and essential message: you bought things not just for need, but to express your inner sense of yourself to others.
There's a psychology of dress. Have you ever thought about it? How it can express your character? You all have interesting characters, but some of them are all hidden. I wonder why you all want to dress always the same, with the same hats and the same coats. I'm sure all of you are interesting and have wonderful things about you, but looking at you in the street, you all look so much the same. And that's why I'm talking to you about the psychology of dress. Try and express yourselves better in your dress. Bring out certain things that you think are hidden. I wonder if you've thought of this angle of your personality.
I'd like to ask you some questions. Why do you like short skirts?
Oh, because there's more to see.
More to see, eh? What good does that do you?
It makes you more attractive.
It does?
Lo diferente es que nuestra forma de vivir, nuestros valores son la expresión media de la sociedad que nos toca vivir. Y nos aferramos a eso. Pero no ahora por ser presidente. Esto lo pensamos mucho, pasamos más de 10 años de soledad en el calabozo. Y tuvimos 7 años sin leer un libro. Y tuvimos mucho tiempo para pensar. Y descubrimos esto. O logras ser feliz con poco y liviano de equipaje, porque la felicidad está dentro tuyo, o no logras nada. Esto no es una apología de la pobreza, esto es una apología de la sobriedad. Pero como hemos inventado una sociedad de consumo, consumista, y la economía tiene que crecer, porque si no crece es una tragedia. Inventamos una montaña de consumo superfluo y hay que tirar y vivir comprando y tirando. Y lo que estamos gastando es tiempo de vida. Porque cuando yo compro algo, o tú, no lo compras con plata. Lo compras con el tiempo de vida que tuviste que gastar para tener esa plata. Pero con esta diferencia. La única cosa que no se puede comprar es la vida. La vida se gasta. Y es miserable gastar la vida para perder libertad.
Nós estamos numa sociedade de mau caráter, que para te considerar exige que você tenha mau caráter, que você seja conivente, que você seja um agente da perversidade social, que você ignore todo o sofrimento dessa maioria, toda a injustiça, você tem que ignorar. Se você tem um pingo de consciência, um pingo de sentimento, você vai se maltratar para ser respeitado. Mas aí é que entra a razão enquadrada, a razão te convence que é isso mesmo, que sempre foi assim, você tem que fazer, se você não fizer você vai perder seu patamar, você vai ter problema, você tem que garantir, e olha as crianças que você tem que criar, olha o patamar, e você viola a sua consciência, você massacra seus sentimentos, achando que é inevitável. Por isso que as pessoas correm para o antidepressivo, que é um entorpecente de consciência e sentimentos, para você seguir uma razão que está aprisionada em valores falsos, criados por uma galera que é contratada para fazer a cabeça da população. Psicólogos do inconsciente, publicitários, jornalistas, antropólogos, sociólogos, tudo contratado, colocado na mídia, constituindo laboratórios de pensamento que planejam a mentalidade a ser implantada, os valores, a visão de mundo, a própria realidade, eles distorcem, e a mídia vai dentro da casa de todo mundo e coloca. Há pouco tempo atrás eu soube que o Estado estava dando o conversor de televisão digital na cesta básica. É generosidade isso? O Estado não garante os direitos constitucionais, não garante boa alimentação, não garante moradia, não garante porra nenhuma, mas dá o conversor de televisão digital. Isso é controle mental, é evidente que é controle mental. Precisa ter uma televisão na casa daquele miserável para que ele continue se sentindo incompetente. O cara não tem chão na casa dele, mas ele tem uma televisão ali funcionando. Isso é uma necessidade do sistema social. A televisão, é o que eu sempre digo, velho, quando você liga a televisão, você acabou de abrir a porta para o inimigo. Ele vai lá dentro da sua cabeça para construir a sua visão de mundo, construir os seus desejos, seus objetivos de vida, suas opiniões, seu comportamento, seus valores. Só que tudo implantado, tudo artificial, tudo falso.
They Live from 1988 is definitely one of the forgotten masterpieces of the Hollywood left. It tells the story of John Nada, nada, of course, in Spanish means nothing, a pure subject, deprived of all substantial content, a homeless worker in LA who, drifting around, one day enters into an abandoned church and finds there a strange box full of sunglasses. And when he put one of them on, walking along the LA streets, he discovers something weird. That these glasses function like critique of ideology glasses. They allow you to see the real message beneath all the propaganda, publicity, glitz, posters, and so on. You see a large publicity board telling you have your holiday of a lifetime, and when you put the glasses on, you see just on the white background a gray inscription. We live, so we are told, in a post-ideological society. We are interpellated, that is to say, addressed by social authority, not as subjects who should do their duty, sacrifice themselves, but subjects of pleasures. Realize your true potential, be yourself, lead a satisfying life. When you put the glasses on, you see dictatorship in democracy. It's the invisible order which sustains your apparent freedom.
Hey, buddy. You gonna pay for that or what? Look, buddy, I don't want no hassle today. Either pay for it or put it back.
In 1988, Noam Chomsky co-authored a book with Edward Herman called Manufacturing Consent. It blasted apart the notion that media acts as a check on political power, that media inform the public, serve the public, so that we can better engage in the political process. In fact, media manufacture our consent. They tell us what those in power need them to tell us so we can fall in line. Democracy is staged with the help of media that work as propaganda machines. Media operate through 5 filters. The first has to do with ownership. Mass media firms are big corporations. Often they're part of even bigger conglomerates. Their endgame, profit. And so it's in their interest to push for whatever guarantees that profit. Critical journalism takes second place to the needs and interests of the corporation. The second filter exposes the real role of advertising. Media costs a lot more than consumers will ever pay. So who fills the gap? Advertisers. And what are the advertisers paying for? Audiences. And so it isn't so much that the media are selling you a product, their output. They're also selling advertisers a product, you. How does the establishment manage the media? That's the third filter. Journalism cannot be a check on power because the very system encourages complicity. Governments, corporations, big institutions know how to play the media game. They know how to influence the news narrative. They feed media scoops, official accounts, interviews with the experts. They make themselves crucial to the process of journalism. So those in power and those who report on them are in bed with each other. If you want to challenge power, You'll be pushed to the margins. Your name won't be down. You won't be getting in. You've lost your access. You've lost the story. When the media, journalists, whistleblowers, sources, stray away from the consensus, they get flat. That's the fourth filter. When the story is inconvenient for the powers that be, you'll see the flat machine in action, discrediting sources, trashing stories, and diverting the conversation. To manufacture consent, you need an enemy, a target. That common enemy is the fifth filter. Communism, terrorists, immigrants, a common enemy. A boogeyman to fear helps corral public opinion. 5 filters, one big media theory. Consent is being manufactured all around you, all the time.
Eu vi a população virar as costas para Dilma. Eu vi. E eu vi o poder de uma televisão dentro de um país de terceiro mundo. O que é um país de terceiro mundo desinformado? Onde uma televisão manipula o país, elege e derruba quem eles querem. Então a gente está usando todo tipo de droga. Cocaína, maconha, balinho, lança-perfume, novela da Globo, Jornal Nacional, todas as drogas possíveis. Vamos usar todas e vamos chapar. Vamos chapar? Vamos chapar de novela e chapar de Rede Globo e chapar de Jornal Nacional. Vamos chapar de William Bonner. Hein? Tinha que ter uma maconha com o nome de William Bonner, né? Enquanto a favela faz silêncio, a elite manipula.
The media matter, and while the ongoing political power struggles racking Brazil began with a case of state corruption, the so-called car wash scandal, Brazilian news outlets, starting with Globo, have played a critical role in this story and its political aftermath.
The media has become a political player that is powerful enough to influence public opinion. Over the last 10 to 15 years, the media took a very clear political position against the governments in power, and the country became divided in two, between those who supported the previous government and those who did not want it to remain in power.
It was Globo that put thousands and thousands of people in the streets to demonstrate against President Dilma.
Na cobertura do esporte, vamos falar das manifestações que acontecem pelo país.
That's political, not journalistic work. It acted like a political party.
At the summit of the Brazilian media oligarchy stand the Marinhos, the richest family in the country and the owners of Globo. Globo's conglomerate beams out programming nationwide, from the Amazon in the north to Iguaçu Falls in the south. And its flagship newscast, Jornal Nacional, is an agenda-setting, broadcasting institution. And Globo is more than a national TV network. In addition to its 122 regionally affiliated TV stations, it owns radio networks and a 24-hour news channel. It distributes other broadcasters' channels on its own satellite, in addition to owning the newspapers that gave the company its start back in 1925. There's a well-known political maxim here in Brazil that sums up just how powerful, how influential Globo has become. It goes like this: if Globo doesn't show it, it didn't happen.
O Jornal Nacional.
Jornal Nacional is without any doubt the highest quality news program in the country. It is also extremely conservative, both politically and socially. There are also numerous examples of politicians having timed specific decisions and speeches so that they might appear on Jornal Nacional on the same day.
Boa tarde, Renata. Boa tarde a todos. Havia uma grande expectativa em torno desse pronunciamento do presidente Michel Temer.
Jornal Nacional remains the most significant national media power associated with political power.
Nacional associado ao poder político.
Quando a gente pensa que a internet hoje...
Consider for a moment that only 50% of Brazilians have internet access and that the remaining 50% are the poorest of the population. You can understand why television has become the most important information source. Globo is the most significant economic and political player in the industry, not only because it's the most watched and farthest reaching, but also because it's the media group that has been most favoured by the Brazilian state throughout history.
Globo and the military government that took power in Brazil in a 1964 coup had a symbiotic relationship. Globo backed that coup and supported the military dictatorship right through until 1985.
All you need to do is read the headlines of the O Globo newspaper from the days following the coup. They were celebrating the fall of a constitutional government, of an elected government. They supported the coup.
The military government put their support behind a media group that was still growing. And they facilitated that growth, partly by providing public funds and partly by not imposing any rules against the concentration of ownership.
In 2013, almost 30 years after the end of military rule, Globo apologized for backing the coup, but not for its coverage of the regime that followed.
E há também o reconhecimento de erros, como o apoio editorial ao golpe militar de 1964.
And Globo produced some of its most infamous journalism during that 21-year period. In January 1984, hundreds of thousands of demonstrators took to the streets of São Paulo demanding a return to democracy. Globo could not ignore the story, but instead of reporting the facts, it told its viewers that what they were watching was a celebration.
Festa em São Paulo. A cidade comemorou seus 430 anos com mais de 500 solenidades.
The point is that in a military state or a feudal state or what we would nowadays call a totalitarian state, it doesn't much matter what people think because you've got a bludgeon over their head and you can control what they do. But when the state loses the bludgeon, when you can't control people by force, and when the voice of the people can be heard, you have this problem. It may make people so curious and so arrogant that they don't have the humility to submit to a civil rule, and therefore you have to control what people think. And the standard way to do this is to resort to what in more honest days used to be called propaganda, manufacture of consent, creation of necessary illusions, various ways of either marginalizing the general public or reducing them to apathy in some fashion.
That's the origins of the modern public relations industry. It impressed American intellectuals who developed the conception of what they called manufacture of consent, control of thought. Impressed Hitler, who blamed the German defeat on superior Anglo-American propaganda and vowed that next time Germany would be prepared. And it has led in England and the United States primarily, England secondarily, to huge industries devoted to control of thought and attitudes because you cannot control people by force.
The roots of the story lie way back in the America of the 1920s with one man. He was called Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud. Bernays had been one of the inventors of the profession of public relations, and he was fascinated by his uncle's theory that human behavior was driven by unconscious sexual and aggressive drives. Many of Bernays' clients were large American corporations, and he was the first person to show them how they could sell many more products if they linked them through images and symbols to those unconscious desires that Freud had identified.
Hi, Doctor. Good to see you. Come on up over here. There you go. Doctor, tell me again what the doctor is. What are we dealing with here? You're the father of public relations.
What we're dealing with really is the concept that people will believe me more if you call me doctor.
Oh, I see. That's a good idea.
And this new marketing culture began to take over the institutions previously dominated by a patrician elite, in particular the world of journalism. The assault was led by the profession of public relations.
Clinton was in serious trouble. He had lost the '94 election. He had lost control of Congress, and he hired me to come back and help save him.
What Morris told Clinton was that to win re-election, he would have to transform the very nature of politics. The crucial swing voters in the suburbs now thought and behaved like consumers. The only way to win them back was to forget all ideology and instead turn politics into a form of consumer business. Clinton must try to identify their personal desires and whims and then promise to fulfill them. If he followed those consumer rules, they would follow him.
I said that I felt the most important thing for him to do was to bring to the political system the same consumer rules philosophy that the business community has. Because I think politics needs to be as responsive to the whims and the desires of the marketplace as business is. And it needs to be as sensitive to the bottom line, profits or votes, as a business is. I think that all of this involves really a changed view of the voters, so that instead of treating them as targets, you treat them as owners. Instead of treating them as something that you can manipulate, you treat them as something you need to learn from. And instead of feeling that you can stay in one place and you can manipulate the voters, you need to learn what they want and move yourself to accommodate it.
As the election campaign began, Clinton revealed Morris's new approach to a shocked White House. All traditional policies were to be dropped. Instead, he would concentrate exclusively on policies that targeted the worries of the swing voters. V-chips would be fitted into televisions to prevent children from watching pornography. And mobile phones would be fitted into school buses to make parents feel more secure. Dick Morris also persuaded the president to spend his leisure time in the same way as particular groups of swing voters. He sent Clinton on a hunting holiday, dressed in exactly the Gore-Tex outfits a group called Big Sky Families liked. The aim was to reflect swing voters' lifestyles back to them. The Liberals in Clinton's cabinet hated this approach.
And I would say, well, Dick, why have a campaign? This was the 1996 campaign. If all the president is going to do is offer up these little bite-sized miniature initiatives that appeal to people's desires, like consumers, buying soap, V-chips that you could put in your televisions so you could make sure that your children did not have pornography, and school uniforms. Why talk about them? They're so mundane and they're so tiny. And he would say back, if we don't do this, we may not get reelected. And I would say, what's the point of getting reelected if you have no mandate to do anything when you're reelected? And he'd say, what's the point of having a mandate if you can't get reelected?
Elections have, for a long time, been pretty much public relations extravaganzas. They only marginally deal with issues. They're mostly show. They're run by the public relations industry. It has a goal. Advertisers, for one thing, are interested in making money. But there's a general goal, and that is to create a certain kind of society, a society in which uninformed people make irrational decisions. That's essentially the structure of presidential campaigns. And it's very strikingly similar to the way the same institutions, advertisers, public relations, it's the same way they try to construct markets. I mean, if you take an economics course, you're taught that markets are based on informed consumers making rational choices. But anyone who's ever looked at a television ad knows that the goal of those who structure the market is to create uninformed consumers who make irrational choices. If markets were structured the way they're supposed to be in principle, then say General Motors, if it wanted to advertise on television, it would have a brief advertisement saying, here are the characteristics of the models that we have for sale next year. Well, that's a way to create informed consumers who will make rational choices. That's what maybe Consumer Reports tries to do. But certainly General Motors doesn't try to do that. They put there's an ad with a football hero or an actress or something with a car doing some impossible thing like shooting up into the sky or whatever it may be. Well, that's undermining markets, and it's for good reasons. That's the way you create wants. You try to delude people into pursuing what you want them to do, namely buy your car, not someone else's, and so on. And the same institutions undermine democracy in the same way. The candidate comes to town with his PR apparatus. They try to organize people to come and listen to him. He then gives them a canned speech written by his speechwriters, which are designed through focus groups and others to appeal to people. They may have absolutely nothing to do with his intentions or goals, if he even has any. He may not. And then people are supposed to say, okay, we'll vote for you. That's the first step in undermining democracy. The next step is when you go into the electoral campaign itself. And what you have is by now multi-billion dollars of campaigns based heavily on advertising. And advertising has its usual goals, not to inform people, but to delude them into following certain paths. And anyone who's paid attention to a presidential campaign sees this all the time. And furthermore, the advertising industry is completely aware of it. So, for example, after Obama's victory in 2008, the advertising industry, which they give an award every year for the best marketing campaign of the year, they gave it to Obama. He beat out Apple Computer that year, meaning he was able to delude the population better than Apple was, meaning not just the person, but the whole PR apparatus that surrounds him.
Você, como grande nome da TV, chegou a ser procurado por algum candidato na primeira eleição direta para presidente depois do fim do regime militar? Que conselho objetivo você deu?
Então, nós fomos procurados pela assessoria do Collor, e o Miguel Pires Gonçalves é que viu que eu desse alguns palpites, e eu achei que a briga do Collor com o Lula nos debates estava desigual, porque o Lula era o povo e o Collor era a autoridade. Então nós conseguimos tirar a gravata do Collor, botar um pouco de suor com uma glicerinazinha e colocamos as pastas todas que estavam ali com supostas denúncias contra o Lula, mas as pastas estavam inteiramente vazias, com papéis em branco. Foi uma maneira de melhorar a postura do Collor junto ao espectador para ficar em pé de igualdade com a popularidade do Lula.
O suor de Collor no debate, então, foi produzido?
Todo aquele debate não o conteúdo. O conteúdo era do Collor mesmo. Mas a parte, vamos dizer assim, formal, nós é que fizemos. Eu me lembrei do Jânio, só não botei uma caspazinha no Collor porque ele não aceitou.
In 1989, in Brazil's first national election in more than 2 decades, a debate took place between Globo's favored candidate, Fernando Collor, and the leftist candidate, Lula da Silva. Actually, there were 2 debates, the one that really happened and the version Globo edited heavily and put on the air.
The way the debate was edited was one of the biggest scandals in Brazilian television history.
Reveja agora alguns momentos do debate.
It showed the best of Collor and the worst of Lula.
Está uma candidatura que esposa teses estranhas ao nosso meio, teses marxistas.
After some time, Globo's owners became disenchanted with Collor, and so they campaigned to get him impeached.
Que levou ao impeachment do Collor.
No caso do Grupo Globo, it's not only Globo, it is also true of all the other mainstream media groups that they have been aligned historically with politically conservative interests that defend the status quo, supporting the interests of the dominant elite in Brazil. If you make a historical analysis, they continue to act the same, representing the same interests.
That's what many Brazilians saw in the movement that brought down President Dilma Rousseff last year. Globo and other like-minded media groups campaigning to overthrow a democratically elected government.
O ritmo das bombas políticas que estão caindo sobre Brasília é ritmo quase diário.
A counter-movement against media outlets with political agendas was born. Globo's reporters in the field were confronted with accusations of backing a coup.
Tumultuado com esse pedido de prisão.
A golpe in Portuguese. At the same time, a term was popularized. Media outlets were called Partido da Imprensa Golpista, which translates to Party of the Pro-Coup Press.
Brazil's powerful media monopolies have grown into what they are, largely because of a regulatory vacuum. There is no broadcast regulator here, which is extraordinary for a country of this size. There's no law preventing politicians from owning media outlets, so many of them do. Many countries ban media cross-ownership, the same proprietor owning multiple media outlets in the same market. Again, Brazil has no such law. In fact, the closest thing to a law regulating the media in this country was passed more than half a century ago.
1963. And why?
because that's the way Globo wants. Every time a Brazilian congressman tried to change that, had his character assassinated by Globo. There is no law. The law is whatever Globo wants to do.
When this issue, the possibility of regulation, was raised in Brazil a few years ago, you know what the reaction was from the media? They said this was tantamount to censorship. They sold the idea that the government wanted to censor the media.
Esse é argumento que é usado pelos grupos que não
That's the argument used by the groups who oppose regulation. They accuse anyone who wants to end this oligopoly of trying to censor the content. There is a provision in the Brazilian constitution that says that media cannot be a monopoly or an oligopoly. In fact, if that had ever been written into regulation, we wouldn't be in the situation we find ourselves today.
Então, a Constituição brasileira The Constitution prohibits politicians from controlling broadcasters, but there's no legislation to enforce that. So there are 40 politicians in Brazil who directly own radio and TV stations. You're the mayor of a city, and you also own the main newspaper, radio or TV station. You use the media to remain in power, or you reach power and then you acquire media outlets and use what should be a public service for your own political benefit.
Lula and Dilma had not the political courage to face Globo. They say that they didn't have the political consensus or the political power to do that, but in the end, when Dilma was kicked out of power, they recognized that they had made their greatest mistake.
O presidente da Câmara, Eduardo Cunha, acaba de anunciar que acolheu de abertura de processo de impeachment contra a presidente Dilma Rousseff.
They blinked and Globo kicked them out of power.
For Brazilians, 7 p.m. is TV time. This is Globo's magic programming slot. 3 straight hours of the country's top TV novelas.
Boa noite.
Boa noite. With the nation's most watched news hour, Jornal Nacional, right in between. Elsewhere, TV news might be in crisis, but in Brazil, more than 70% of the population get the entirety of their news, all of it, from television. And Globo is the largest network in the country.
That Jornal Nacional, it's so influential, it can just change the entire view of the country. Just one night only, you can change the entire course of the debate in the country.
É a fonte de informação das pessoas.
It's the go-to source of information, with news that shapes the way people think.
O Jornal Nacional está começando.
Creating a version of reality that people end up accepting as the truth. It's the production of a hegemony of thought, of an interpretation of the facts which presents itself as the truth.
Acaba aceitando que aquilo é verdade.
Globo is the first and most powerful power in this country. It's more important than the parties, the church. The editor-in-chief for the evening news of Globo is the most powerful politician in this country.
Vamos tentar parar para pensar na televisão brasileira. Muitas pessoas viram noites e noites nessa função. Para um pouco para pensar. Se imagina, ó. Hoje o café da cabeceira esfria igual para as emoções. Janela aberta nem sem dia, tempo ruim sem previsões. Nada de paz, os sonhos estão mortos no lençóis. Sem voz, sem ações, suas razões esperançosas dormem a sós. TV testa fidelidade, investe em falsa liberdade. Te congela e fecha imagem, traz mensagem distorcida das festas e futilidade. Mas jamais fiz por quem chora atrás dos restos de maquiagem. Nem quem despertador Big Brother 984. Só tranca seu quarto, seu tempo sentado, seu trago. Seu trampo sentado, se servindo sem ver sentido, sem teto, seu estado no estúdio, não avista a intenção do inimigo. Papai Noel veste vermelho e te traz coca, te lacra na embalagem dos puros interesse em troca. Não tem como sair, mas já nem nota. O mundo é de plástico e tem quem finge não enxergar o que nos sufoca, irmão.